In the year 1753, a boy drew his first breath in the village of Woburn. The room was small and the fire low. His mother held him close while snow tapped the window. Outside, the world felt heavy with old rules and new whispers. Benjamin learned the feel of cold air on his face before he learned many words. He followed his father into the fields when he could stand. He watched how water froze in the bucket and how the sun melted it again by noon. These small changes held his attention longer than games with other children. His father left the family early. The boy grew quiet after that. He turned instead to the tools left behind. A broken clock became his first study. He took it apart on the kitchen table and tried to put the wheels back in order. Most times they did not fit, yet he kept trying until the light faded. Books reached him through a neighbor who owned a few volumes. Benjamin read by the hearth when chores ended. The words about stars and air and motion stayed with him. He copied diagrams on scraps of paper with charcoal. The lines were uneven, but they matched the shapes in his mind. The town itself grew restless around him. Men spoke of taxes sent across the sea. Ships brought news that stirred voices in the meeting house. Benjamin listened from the back bench. He did not yet join the talk. Instead, he wondered what forces moved people the way wind moved leaves. One afternoon, he stood at the edge of a pond. Ice formed at the edges in thin sheets. He pressed his finger to the surface and felt the cold travel upward. Later, he tried the same test with a cup of water left on the windowsill. He noted the time it took for the skin to appear. No one asked why he kept such records. School lessons came and went. He finished what was required and asked for more. The teacher sometimes loaned him extra pages. Benjamin carried them home, wrapped in cloth. At night, he traced the letters until his eyes grew heavy. Dreams of distant cities filled the spaces between sleep and waking. His mother watched him with quiet concern. She needed help with the house and the younger ones, yet she saw the way his hands moved over any object that could be taken apart. She let him keep a small corner of the shed for his bits of metal and glass. There he mixed powders from the garden and watched what happened when water touched them. The year turned and the talk of distant laws grew louder. Red-coated soldiers passed on the road once or twice. Benjamin stood at the gate and counted their steps. He noticed how their boots struck the ground in the same rhythm. Order like that interested him. He wondered what kept it from breaking apart. By the time he reached his 12th year, the village knew him as the boy who asked too many questions. He accepted the label without argument. Questions led him to the next experiment and the next page. Ambition sat inside him like a steady flame that needed only air to grow. The air around him carried both the scent of pine and the first hints of change. He walked the same paths each evening. The trees stood the same, yet the light between their branches seemed thinner each autumn. He carried that thin light home and tried to hold it a little longer in his work. The colony around him waited. So did the boy. The air around him carried both the scent of pine and the first hints of change. He walked the same paths each evening. The trees stood the same, yet the light between their branches seemed thinner each autumn. He carried that thin light home and tried to hold it a little longer in his work. The colony around him waited. So did the boy. War came in small steps at first. News travelled by rider. Voices rose in taverns. Then the shots at Lexington broke the quiet. Thompson heard the reports and measured their weight. He chose the side that offered order, the British side. He began to listen more than speak. Neighbours shared plans without knowing his ears. He wrote notes in careful script. The notes travelled north to Boston. Each line held names and numbers. Each line helped the redcoats prepare. The farm grew tense. His wife watched the road. The boy played with wooden soldiers. Thompson kept his experiments running by day. At night, he met quiet men in barns. They spoke of troop movements. They spoke of supply lines. Spring turned to summer. The fighting spread. Thompson rode when needed. He carried messages wrapped in oilcloth. He returned before dawn. The risk grew with each ride, yet the work felt necessary. One evening, a rider brought fresh word. American forces gathered outside Boston. Thompson wrote the details quickly. He sealed the paper and sent it on. That night he slept little. The house creaked in the wind. His position grew thin. Whispers turned to stares. A neighbor asked too many questions. Thompson smiled and changed the subject. He knew the time to leave drew near. The escape came in winter. He packed few things: papers, instruments, a change of clothes. He left the boy with his wife. The parting held no long words, only a nod at the door. He reached the British lines by boat. The oars dipped in dark water. The city of Boston waited ahead. Soldiers took him in. They read his reports and nodded. From there the ship sailed east. England rose on the horizon after weeks at sea. The wind cut cold across the deck. Thompson stood at the rail. He carried the same thin light inside him still. The colony felt far away now. London streets welcomed him with noise. He found rooms near the scientific societies. Old contacts listened to his stories. They offered work and shelter. The flight had ended. A new chapter waited in the fog. London streets welcomed him with noise. He found rooms near the scientific societies. Old contacts listened to his stories. They offered work and shelter. The flight had ended. A new chapter waited in the fog. He walked the narrow lanes each morning. Fog clung to the stones. Carriages rattled past without pause. He carried letters from old friends. These opened doors one by one. A minister received him in a quiet office. The man asked about the colonies. Benjamin answered with care. He spoke of order and loyalty. The minister nodded and offered a post. It came with modest pay and long hours. Work began at once. He drafted reports on supply lines. Numbers filled his days, yet evenings stayed free. He set up a small bench in his rooms. Gunpowder samples arrived from the arsenals. He measured how they burned. Heat rose from each test. He noted the patterns in a worn notebook. Word spread among the learned men. They invited him to meetings. He stood before them and described his trials. Voices murmured approval. One fellow offered better equipment. Another promised an introduction at court. The first royal audience came on a damp afternoon. He entered the chamber with steady steps. The king asked about the war across the sea. Benjamin replied with measured facts. He kept his voice low and clear. The thin light inside him held steady. The king listened. New rooms opened after that day. Patronage followed in quiet letters. He gained access to larger workshops. Assistants joined him for the heavier tasks. Experiments grew in scale. He tested how cloth held warmth. He tracked how metal cooled. Each result led to the next question. Society doors swung wider. Fellows of the Royal Society called on him. They examined his data sheets. Some offered small grants. Others shared rare instruments. Recognition built like layers of stone. His name appeared in printed notices. He kept the colonial years at a distance. London fog wrapped the past. New experiments filled the hours instead. Heat became his steady companion. He watched it move through solids and air. Patterns emerged that others had missed. Court circles drew him further in. Invitations arrived for dinners and levees. He spoke little of politics. Science filled the gaps. Patrons smiled at his quiet certainty. Doors to greater offices stood ready. The thin light inside remained unchanged. It guided each measurement and each report. London had become the ground beneath his feet. Experiments waited each evening. Recognition grew with every careful step. The fog thinned around him at last. A summons crossed the channel at last. It carried the elector's seal. Thompson read the lines twice. He packed his instruments with care. London's lamps faded behind the coach wheels. The road led south through rain and hills. Each village passed in quiet rhythm. He measured the miles by the weight of what waited ahead. Bavaria opened before him like an untended field. The army stood scattered and idle. Thompson walked the barracks at dawn. He noted slack drills and empty ledgers. New orders followed within weeks. Regiments shrank to useful size. Pay reached the men on time. Training filled the daylight hours. Winter quarters brought fresh plans. Thompson turned to the poor who lined the streets. Workhouses rose on the city edge. Gardens replaced idle lots. Soup kitchens served warm meals each noon. Children learned trades beside the looms. The elector watched these changes from his carriage. He granted new authority with each report. Thompson's notebooks filled with figures and sketches. Heat from the kitchen fires warmed the workshops above. Public gardens opened the following spring. Paths wound among ordered beds. Citizens walked there on Sundays. The air smelled of turned earth and fresh bread. Honors arrived in measured steps. A title formed in court letters. Count Rumford. The name settled over his shoulders like a measured cloak. Bavaria's reforms held through another season. The army stood ready yet smaller. Welfare houses ran without waste. Thompson walked the grounds at evening. Lantern light caught the edges of new buildings. He paused at the gate one clear night. Stars showed above the ordered fields. The work continued without his voice each day. Recognition had found its place. The chapter closed on that quiet ground. Thompson turned from the gate. His thoughts shifted toward the unseen forces at work in the world. Heat had always seemed a simple thing. Now it called for closer attention. The old ideas no longer held. He set up a workshop in the barracks yard. Cannons stood ready for testing. Boring tools cut into the metal with steady force. Shavings curled away in long ribbons. Temperature rose without any added flame. He measured each rise with care. Mercury thermometers tracked the climb. Friction alone produced the warmth. The caloric fluid theory began to crack. No hidden substance flowed out of the metal. Motion itself turned into heat. Soldiers watched from a distance. They saw the steam rise from the fresh bore. Rumford noted every detail in his journal. Each trial repeated the same result. The numbers climbed higher with longer boring. Insulation came next. Fabric layers trapped air pockets. Wool blankets gained new linings. Coats for the troops grew lighter yet warmer. Heat stayed close to the body. Cold wind found no easy path inside. He tested the materials in open fields. Men stood exposed for hours. Those in the new garments stayed steady. The others shivered and withdrew. Simple design changes brought clear gains. The army kitchens followed the same path. Pots received double walls. Steam circulated between them. Fuel burned lower and lasted longer. Meals reached the men still hot. Waste dropped away. Each invention served the same end. Less loss meant more strength in the ranks. Workshops produced the first batches. Tailors stitched under his watch. Patterns spread to other regiments. Reports returned with praise. Men marched farther without complaint. Officers noted the drop in illness. Rumford returned to his notes each evening. Pages filled with diagrams. Heat flow appeared as straight lines through barriers. Poor conductors became allies. Feathers, cork, and wool earned new respect. He built small models first. Then full-scale versions followed. Fireplaces in the barracks changed shape. Narrow throats drew smoke upward. Wide hearths reflected warmth outward. Rooms stayed comfortable on half the wood. The soldiers gathered closer on winter nights. Conversation lasted longer. Morale rose with the steady temperature. Old theories still lingered in books. Rumford prepared lectures to challenge them. Demonstrations used simple tools. A cannon barrel and a blunt borer sufficed. Audiences saw the heat appear from nothing but motion. Doubts began to fade. Military supply lines adopted the changes. Uniform contracts specified the new linings. Kettles arrived with insulated jackets. Field tents gained ground cloths of layered felt. Every item carried the mark of measured heat. He walked the drill grounds again. Men moved with less stiffness. Their faces showed the difference. Science had stepped into daily life. The barracks felt the result. Further trials refined the work. One fabric lost heat slower than another. Records compared each variant. The best combination became standard issue. Recognition arrived from distant capitals. Letters asked for patterns and measurements. He sent diagrams without delay. The method traveled faster than the man. Inside the workshop, the tools rested. The last cannon cooled in the evening air. Rumford closed his journal. The day's numbers matched the ones before. Friction remained the steady source. The grounds fell quiet once more. Lanterns moved along the paths. Another set of ordered fields lay ahead. The work held its own direction now. The ordered fields now gave way to wider stretches of neglected ground beyond the city walls. Rumford walked the edges at first light. Weeds choked the soil. Rubble lay scattered where old fortifications had crumbled. He measured the distances with steady steps. Plans formed quickly in his mind. The land could feed and employ those who had nothing. Work began with simple tools and willing hands. Crews cleared stones first. They dug channels for water to flow. Trees arrived in carts from nearby hills. Each sapling found its place along new paths. The design followed English models he had seen years before. Lawns opened into groves. Ponds reflected the sky. Ponds, the poor came next. Many stood idle at the gates. Rumford offered them steady labor instead of alms. They received warm coats and daily rations. In return, they shaped the earth. Shovels turned the soil. Paths widened under their feet. Gardens took shape row by row. Inside the city walls, he turned to the workhouses. Empty buildings stood ready. Fires were lit in the stoves each dawn. Soup kettles simmered with barley and vegetables. Men and women entered at set hours. They spun wool or wove cloth under supervision. Children learned simple trades beside them. No one left hungry. The English garden grew outward each season. Meadows replaced waste. Walkers found shade beneath young oaks. Soldiers drilled on open lawns when the weather allowed. Rumford inspected the progress often. He noted yields from the kitchen plots. Surplus vegetables reached the workhouse tables. Winter tested the system. Snow covered the new paths, yet the houses stayed warm. Extra blankets came from the looms. The destitute found shelter where none had existed before. Numbers in the ledgers showed fewer beggars on the streets. Rumford adjusted details as needed. Soil was enriched with stable refuse. More trees were planted along the riverbank. The workhouses added evening lessons in reading for those who wished them. Order held because every task carried clear purpose. By spring, the first flowers appeared in the borders. Public days brought families into the garden. Public days brought families into the garden. Children ran across grass once thought useless. The poor who labored there walked with quiet pride. The city itself seemed to breathe more easily. Rumford closed each day with a final circuit. He watched lanterns glow along the new avenues. The transformation stood complete in its first stage. Further fields waited beyond. The same steady method would serve them all. After years abroad, the familiar shores of England drew Rumford back across the water. He stepped ashore in London with the same measured stride that had carried him through foreign courts and battle lines. The city greeted him with its usual roar of carriages and voices. Yet something quieter stirred beneath the noise. He carried fresh ideas shaped by every mile he had travelled. London felt both unchanged and newly open. Old friends welcomed him at familiar clubs. They listened as he spoke of practical improvements tested in Munich. Rumford described how simple stoves and workhouses had lifted daily life for thousands. His listeners leaned forward. They asked what such methods might achieve at home. He began to sketch a larger plan. Science itself needed a permanent home in the capital, not a closed academy for scholars alone, a place where lectures would reach merchants and artisans, where demonstrations would show ordinary men and women how heat and light and motion worked. The idea grew clearer each evening he spent by his desk. Support gathered slowly at first. A few influential voices lent their names. Meetings were held in quiet drawing rooms. Rumford laid out the charter with precise language. The institution would advance knowledge and diffuse it widely. No one would be turned away for lack of title or wealth. The doors would stand open to any curious mind. The first rooms were secured near Albemarle Street. Carpenters fitted benches and a modest lecture stage. Apparatus arrived in crates from instrument makers. Rumford supervised each placement himself. He tested the sight lines so every seat would see the experiments clearly. Lanterns were hung at the right height. The space felt ready before the first audience arrived. Opening night brought a mixed crowd. Gentlemen in fine coats sat beside clerks and shopkeepers. Women attended in greater numbers than at older societies. Rumford stepped to the front and began without flourish. He showed how a simple heat reflector could warm a room with less fuel. The audience watched the flame and the rising temperature gauge. Murmurs of understanding spread along the rows. Subsequent lectures followed the same pattern. Each week, a new topic was presented with working models. Chemistry demonstrations produced visible reactions in glass vessels. Mechanical principles were illustrated by balanced weights and moving levers. Rumford kept every explanation brief and repeatable. He wanted listeners to try the ideas at home or in their workshops. The institution grew by steady attendance rather than sudden fame. Word passed through coffeehouses and printing shops. Young apprentices saved pennies to attend on free evenings. Rumford noted the faces that returned week after week. He added more sessions to meet the demand. The building stayed lit later into the evenings. Challenges appeared as the calendar advanced. Some traditional societies viewed the new venture with suspicion. Rumford answered criticism with further demonstrations rather than argument. He invited skeptics to inspect the apparatus themselves. Results spoke louder than printed replies. Attendance continued to rise. By the close of the first season, the lecture hall was regularly full. Plans were drawn for a larger theatre and additional laboratories. Rumford walked the corridors after each event. He checked that every lamp was extinguished and every bench left orderly. The quiet satisfaction of the day settled around him. Outside, London moved on with its usual traffic and calls. Inside, the seeds of wider understanding had taken root. Yet the satisfaction did not last. Restlessness stirred in him again. London held its routines and its lectures. The new laboratories stood ready. Still, Rumford turned his eyes toward the continent. He gathered his notes on light and heat. He booked passage across the Channel. The crossing proved short and smooth. France welcomed him with familiar streets and new faces. In Paris, he met ministers who spoke of order and progress. They listened while he described the careful measurement of radiant heat. He showed them simple instruments he carried in a leather case. They nodded at the results he had recorded in London. One evening he demonstrated how a polished surface could reflect warmth across a table. The room grew quiet as the flame flickered. From Paris he travelled south. The roads wound through vineyards and small villages. He stopped often to note the angle of sunlight on different surfaces. At each inn he unpacked his journals. He wrote late into the night. The questions never left him. Heat moved in ways that still puzzled him. Light seemed to carry its own invisible force. Bavaria drew him next. The elector received him with courtesy and interest. Old ties from earlier years remained strong. Rumford walked the gardens of the palace and spoke of practical improvements. He suggested better lamps for the streets of Munich. He outlined plans for kitchens that would waste less fuel. The elector asked many questions. Rumford answered each one with measured detail. In the weeks that followed, he set up a modest workspace. He tested fabrics under controlled light. He measured how quickly they absorbed or reflected warmth. Servants brought fresh wood for the fires. He recorded every change in temperature. The numbers filled page after page. Sometimes he stood at the window and watched the city below. New ideas formed slowly in his mind. Other travelers arrived from time to time. Scientists from Vienna shared their own observations. Diplomats asked about his work in London. Rumford kept his answers brief and precise. He preferred the laboratory to the drawing room, yet the conversations widened his circle. Letters began to arrive from distant cities. Each one carried fresh questions about heat and motion. He journeyed onward to smaller courts. In each place he demonstrated the same careful experiments. A beam of light passed through a prism. He noted the warmth that followed. Rulers watched with polite attention. Some offered funds for further study. Rumford accepted only what he needed for instruments and travel. He kept his independence. Winter approached. Snow covered the fields along the roads. He returned briefly to Munich. There he refined a new design for a portable stove. The device used less wood yet gave steady heat. Soldiers tested it in the barracks. Reports came back favorable. Rumford added the results to his growing collection of data. Spring brought longer days and clearer skies. He resumed his travels. Italy offered new landscapes and new observers. In Florence he visited old observatories. He compared their records of sunlight with his own measurements. The work felt steady and absorbing. Each day ended with quiet notes written by lamplight. Through all these miles, the central questions remained. How did heat travel through empty space? What rules governed its movement? Rumford carried the same instruments from city to city. He adjusted them with patient hands. The answers came in small increments. He shared them when asked. Otherwise, he kept his own counsel. By summer, he found himself once more on the road north. The continent had offered many faces and many rooms. Leaders had listened. Fellow inquirers had compared notes. Yet the road itself now called him forward. He packed his journals with care. The next border lay ahead. Behind him, the seeds of wider understanding continued to grow in quiet places. Paris received him at the end of that northern road. Streets opened wide under grey skies. He took rooms near the Seine. Quiet settled around his papers and instruments. The work on heat could now resume without interruption. Combustion held his attention first. He built small furnaces in the corner of the apartment. Flames behaved differently when air reached them in measured ways. Smoke rose less when the draft stayed steady. Each trial added a note to his journals. Letters went out to London and Munich. Replies returned with questions of their own. Domestic comfort followed close behind. Fireplaces in Paris wasted fuel and filled rooms with soot. He redesigned the throat of the chimney. The new shape drew smoke upward while reflecting heat into the room. Builders came to watch. They copied the angles he marked on the hearth. Families soon spoke of warmer winters and smaller wood piles. Correspondence filled the remaining hours. He wrote to men who studied light and motion. They shared measurements of temperature and expansion. One letter described a cannon boring experiment from years before. Another asked about the nature of caloric itself. Answers arrived weeks later. Ideas crossed borders faster than armies. Winter passed in steady observation. Spring brought new clay for models. He tested stove designs that separated the firebox from the cooking surface. Heat stayed where it was needed. Kitchens grew cleaner. Servants learned to manage the dampers with fewer burns. Rumford walked the gardens when thoughts needed space. One day, fleet and ready to send its circle, he returned to the workbench with fresh sketches. Each drawing carried a small improvement. Science moved forward one careful change at a time. Letters continued through summer. A Bavarian friend described new insulation methods. An English colleague reported on ventilation trials. Rumford compared every detail with his own results. Disagreements stayed courteous. Shared curiosity outweighed any single claim. By autumn, the fireplace design had spread through several districts. He visited installed examples when invited. Owners pointed to steady temperatures and reduced ash. Satisfaction showed in their voices. He made small adjustments on the spot. The work felt complete for the moment. Later experiments waited in the notes. Heat and motion still held mysteries. He prepared apparatus for measuring the warmth produced by friction. Metal surfaces rubbed under controlled pressure. Temperature rose in ways that challenged older theories. The data filled fresh pages. Later, Paris remained his base. The city offered libraries and skilled instrument makers. He kept the door open to visitors who brought questions. Evenings ended with the journals open on the table. Another line of inquiry always waited. The road north had led here for a reason. Age had settled over his shoulders like a familiar coat. Paris still hummed beyond the windows. Yet the days moved slower now. Friends no longer answered letters. Their chairs stood empty at the tables where ideas once sparked. He walked the same streets each morning. The pace had changed. No longer the hurried steps of a younger man chasing experiments or orders. Loss arrived quietly at first. Then it gathered weight. One by one, the names faded from the journals he kept open on the desk. Rumford remembered the early campaigns. Mud and cannon smoke had taught him discipline before any laboratory did. He had crossed borders with dispatches tucked inside his coat. Later, the same restless drive carried him to courts and workshops across Europe. Movement defined every decade. A soldier became an observer became an inventor. The pattern never paused for long. Now the body protested the old rhythm. Hands that once adjusted delicate thermometers trembled slightly at dawn. He accepted the change without complaint. Reflection filled the spaces that travel once occupied. He turned pages of old notebooks and traced the lines of forgotten measurements. Heat and motion still occupied his thoughts. They had always been the steady companions. Deaths came in clusters during those final seasons. Colleagues who debated caloric theory fell silent. Instrument makers who built his custom devices closed their shops. Each loss prompted a longer look backward. He saw the thread that ran through every posting and every exile. Curiosity had propelled him from one frontier to the next. Never had he stayed in one place long enough for roots to hold. The American years returned in fragments. Forests and farms where he tested insulation methods. London followed with its academies and arguments. Bavaria brought titles and public works that still stood. France offered the libraries and the quiet rooms where theories matured. Each station had required departure. Each departure opened another question. He sat by the fire more often now. Flames reminded him of the experiments on radiant heat. The same fire that once demanded precise recording now invited simple watching. Constant motion had left little room for such stillness. He allowed himself the pause. The mind wandered across the accumulated miles. Friends had warned him once that the road would exact its price. He had answered with another journey. Now the warnings proved true. The ledger of acquaintances grew shorter each season, yet the work remained. Notes accumulated beside the hearth. New questions still formed even when the hand grew tired. Rumford considered the boy who left New England. That boy had carried little more than ambition and a few instruments. The man who remained carried the same ambition wrapped in years of evidence. Wars and courts had tested it. Science had refined it. Solitude now preserved it. The pattern held. Evening light slanted across the table. Journals lay open as always. He read a line from an early paper and smiled at the certainty it once held. Certainty had softened with time. What endured was the habit of inquiry itself. Movement had carried the questions forward. Reflection now gave them room to settle. He closed the book gently. The city outside continued its low murmur. Inside the room the fire settled into coals. Another day of looking back drew to its close. The road north had served its purpose. The years ahead would move at their own measured pace. The years ahead would move at their own measured pace. The years ahead would move at their own measured pace. He sat by the window and let the morning light settle across the papers spread before him. These were not the hurried notes of campaigns or experiments long past. They were plans meant to outlast him. He traced a line with his finger and considered how knowledge might continue without his hand to guide it. The idea had formed over many quiet evenings. Prizes could stir younger minds toward useful questions. He had seen how a single award sometimes drew attention to work that might otherwise remain hidden. Now he would create several such encouragements. One would honor progress in the study of heat and its practical uses. Another would support improvements in the comfort of the poor through better dwellings and fires. He wrote the terms carefully so that future judges would know the intent without his voice to explain it. Each prize carried a modest sum and a medal struck in his adopted name. The medals would bear simple inscriptions about light and warmth. He wanted no grand flourishes that might distract from the work itself. Letters went out to societies in London and Munich and Paris. Some replies arrived quickly, while others took months to cross the borders. He read each response twice before setting it aside. His instruments required attention next. The thermometers and calorimeters had served their purpose in many rooms and kitchens. He arranged for them to travel to institutions where students could repeat the measurements. Detailed drawings accompanied each piece so that copies might be made if originals wore out. He included notes on the small adjustments he had learned through repeated trials. Nothing was left to chance recollection. Papers filled several chests in ordered bundles. Experiments on the nature of heat sat beside records of Bavarian reforms. He added an index written in his own hand so that no future reader would have to guess at the sequence. A final instruction directed that the collection remain open to any serious inquirer. Pete Eno, he did not wish the materials locked away behind fees or permissions. Friends visited from time to time and found him still at the desk. They spoke of old campaigns and shared meals. He listened more than he spoke and returned each evening to the lists. One by one, the arrangements took shape. A small fund was set aside for the upkeep of the instruments. Another supported the printing of selected papers so that cost would not limit access. Winter arrived and slowed his steps. He moved more deliberately between the fire and the table. Still, the work advanced. Drafts of the prize rules were revised until the language felt both precise and generous. He tested the wording aloud in the empty room to hear how it would sound when read by others. Spring brought confirmation that the first awards would be offered within the year. He received the news without ceremony. A single nod acknowledged the step. The legacy was no longer an idea on paper. It had begun its own life among committees and applicants yet unknown. He walked once more through the rooms that held his tools. Each object now carried a label and a destination. The largest calorimeters would go to the academy in Munich. The delicate thermometers would travel to London. He paused at the window again and watched the light change across the city. The road north had served its purpose. What remained was the quiet transfer of curiosity to those who would follow. In the final weeks, he added one last directive. Any income from his writings after his death should support further experiments on the same topics. He signed the document in steady script. The ink dried under the same light that had guided so many earlier pages. He closed the final chest and turned the key. The room felt lighter once the arrangements were complete. He returned to the fire and let the coals settle. Outside, the streets continued their ordinary sounds. Inside, the plans rested in their proper places. The years ahead belonged now to others who would ask new questions with the tools he had left behind. He drew a slow breath and allowed the quiet to hold. The quiet held for a time. Then the years turned once more. Age settled deeper into his frame. The rooms in Paris grew still around him. Letters arrived from distant friends. He read them slowly by the window. The light shifted across the pages. He set each one aside with care. His thoughts returned often to the work already done. Experiments on heat lingered in memory. The friction of metals had shown its own force. Motion itself produced warmth without limit. That simple truth stood ready for others to test. He had left the tools in place. No further claim was needed. Health began to fade in the winter months. Walks grew shorter along the familiar streets. The fire in the grate demanded less tending. He watched the coals settle into ash each evening. Conversations with visitors grew brief. He offered observations when asked. Then he returned to silence. The final days arrived without ceremony. A physician came and went. Rumford remained in the chair by the window. He spoke little. Breath came and went in steady rhythm. The city outside continued its motion. Carriages passed below. Voices rose and faded. On the morning of August 21st, he did not rise. The household moved quietly around the bed. He opened his eyes once more. Light touched the papers on the table. Then the eyes closed. The room held its ordinary sounds. A clock ticked on the mantel. No sudden change marked the moment. Word of his passing spread through letters. Friends in England received the news first. The American Academy noted the date in its records. In Bavaria, the institutions he had shaped continued their daily work. Soup still warmed in the kitchens he had designed. Gardens still fed those who came for aid. The pattern held without his presence. His discoveries on heat moved forward in other hands. The idea that motion generated warmth took root in new experiments. Young scientists measured the same friction. They reached the same conclusion. Heat was not a fluid to be stored. It was the visible sign of particles in motion. Thermodynamics would grow from that single observation. Textbooks later carried his name in footnotes. Public institutions kept his methods alive. Workhouses adopted the same rules of order and economy. Poor relief relied on practical kitchens rather than grand theories. Administrators copied the plans he had drawn. Efficiency became a measure of care. The model traveled across borders. Cities tested the same arrangements. Results followed the same lines he had traced. Applied science gained a clearer shape from his example. Soldiers turned inventors found support in his story. Practical trials stood beside theoretical questions. Pewmates' workshops welcomed measured observation. No discovery needed royal favor to matter. The conduct of experiment itself became the lesson. Students learned to test one variable at a time. Records mattered as much as conclusions. The legacy rested in those quiet habits. A man could leave tools behind. Others would pick them up. The fire still burned in laboratories across Europe. Questions continued without his voice. The streets of Paris kept their ordinary rhythm. Inside the rooms, the papers remained in order. The years ahead belonged now to those who asked new questions with the tools he had left behind. He had drawn his final breath. The quiet held